and welcome. My name is Roberta Carpenter, and I'm happy to share with you some reflections, some realizations, and some concepts that were given to me on my musical path. Gravity impacts our world and our days. When we breathe in, it inspires an exhale. When a ball is dropped, if it's inflated, it will rebound. In music, where the weight of the sound occurs or goes down, it implies that same inhale-exhale, the rebound, and begins to define notes, groups of notes, measures, gestures, phrases, large musical structure, and the elasticity with which we perform. If we contemplate how far down is the down in music and where does the up come from in the music, in our gesture, in our musical performance, our range and vocabulary of the weight in our music will expand. This is appropriate to instrumentalists, vocalists, conductors, and especially in ensembles, to be like-minded about how we execute this weight management. Once we understand where metric balance weight fits into the musical structure, how do we physically enable it in our music making? We'll revisit that question later in the video. In my lifetime, there were aha moments where I began to realize just how profoundly metric balance impacts virtually every note and every phrase that we play. In this video, I look forward to sharing the vision of it with you. Although some of the symbols we'll use in this video are light in character, what they represent in the music is profound. Know that for many years, the concepts were marked very simply, the slash or line of varying thickness to delineate the weights. The characters that you see have come more recently. From single notes to phrases to structural elements, metric balance provides an organizational perspective. Whatever your musical experience or performance level is, I ask that you step back from producing your music for a moment to fully absorb the metric balance concept as it underlies each note you'll perform. In the greatest majority of pieces, the music is heaviest and structurally organized from the first beat of the measure, which is the downbeat. When a downbeat is heaviest, it means the other beats are lighter, unless a conceived dynamic, articulation, or harmony alters the natural progression. Here we see the beats of a 3/4 measure. Notice the natural lessening of weight through it. The anacrusis, or last beat of the measure, is the lightest unless it has an accent. In teaching, I've enjoyed labeling the hierarchy of beats with royal titles. The first beat of a measure is always the king, and the second heaviest beat of a measure is the queen. That leaves the third beat of this 3/4 measure, who is not royalty. It's the lightest beat of the measure, and my students and I have had a good time imagining which character that might be. This is the 3/4 measure with appropriate royal characters. We can see and hear this principle in the minuet in G from Anna Magdalena Bach's notebook, for example. And also in Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 5, third movement, the waltz. This is a 4/4 measure with metric balance. Notice the queen is now on the third beat of the measure because the structural weight and the importance is on the third beat. The second beat is next most significant. We call this beat the knight or the prince. It's lighter than the king or the queen, but more significant than the anacrusis, which is the fourth beat. You'll now hear an excerpt from Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor, first movement. Notice especially the relative weights of the first and the third beats, the king and the queen. You can also hear the 4/4 metric balance structure of heaviest downbeat and the third beat being the second structural beat of the measure in the first movement of Dvorak's Serenade for Strings. This recording is with the Janáček Philharmonic. In a 6/8 measure, the second half of the measure is not the same weight as the first half. If that were the case, it wouldn't sound like a 6/8, it would sound like 2/3/8 measures. This image is a beautiful melody in 6/8 from the second movement of Brahms' Symphony No. 4. And the quaint opening of the second movement of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, which is also in 6/8. A note about 5 beat meters. When the subdivision is 3 + 2, the 3 is heavy and has a lot of rebound, and the 2 is lighter, it's a queen. When the subdivision of a 5 beat meter is 2 + 3, the up motion of the 3 becomes more significant. It must be to carry through the 3 beats. Its vitality does not overtake the king, but it is closer in weight and energy than in the 3 + 2 subdivision. Note that on the conducting demos, you're going to see the beat pattern sort of small, so it's focused for the zoom camera. This is a 5/8 meter with a 3 + 2 subdivision, the 3 being the king. This is also a 5/8 meter, except with a 2 + 3 subdivision. Note the king, still the first beat. Each note has a beginning, middle, and end. Whether on an instrument, in a conductor's beat, or for a vocalist, any note can have, and likely does have, different weights in the duration of its tone. Pianists have a stronger beginning of each note. The piano tone fades after it was struck or played. A percussionist playing a mallet instrument generally has the weight at the front of their note. This is a wonderful visual for conductors who are contemplating what type of cue to give a mallet playing percussionist. A wind player must initiate air or breath to their instrument. Even if they're playing softly, there is a defining moment when their wind engages their instrument. This is the weight of tone we're contemplating. There are different natural consonances we begin notes with. A hard K or C k sound, for example, or a more gentle D da 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 sound. A long, heavy B sound, ba, or a short, rebounding T sound, ta ta ta, or a long but lighter W, wah sound. They all have varying weight. Articulation, for vocalists, string players, or any instrument, imply weight, and it's at the front of the note. How a conductor begins or prepares a beat can and should enable the types of note beginnings we just spoke of. Actually, that's the same for all instrumentalists. Observing the weight in our speaking patterns will give us opportunity to musically speak with that weight in our playing and performing. Violin is the instrument I've played, studied, and performed through my lifetime. It is especially well equipped to execute and demonstrate, both in sound and visually, the metric weight elasticity we're speaking of. Both the violin strings and bow have give in them. When we engage that variance correctly, the weight and expression of the music becomes much more vital and evident. Singers and wind players can also elicit that musical spring or buoyancy in their notes. Notice the recurve or smile shape in the violin bow. It will happily follow along that shape if it is allowed to. It creates a slight lightening of tone at the end of a note, which is appropriate to music of many eras because the tone production is usually heaviest at the beginning. I have a special notation symbol to identify this. It's a recurve or a slight smile shape. You can see this in the example of the minuet that follows. This lifting of the tone is not specific to string playing. It's appropriate for musicians of all types. Anti-gravity is exciting. It's when the weight goes up. When we see a bird fly or rocket launch, it's extraordinary because it seemingly defies gravity. In our music, if we look for where it lifts, we'll find that same sparkle. Notice this lift gesture in the Bach minuet. It's a second symbol I've created to indicate lifting the tone at the end of a note. It's somewhat different than the smile shape because that indicates to put that recurve or smile shape through the note. This is more an indication to lift the end of the note. Let's see if you can hear the lift or smile shape in the sound. The sense of happy or sad can be implied with weight. Let's hear that same minuet with little or no lift. For conductors, the beat can and should reflect this. Each beat, each ictus or point of sound has elasticity. Our baton and beat gesture needs to indicate to the musicians how much rebound or lift their notes should have. For string players, I'd have you consider the weighting of your upbow strokes, since the tip of the bow is lighter than the frog. There's a world of possibility and tendency there. Suffice it to say, if you're not considering its weight compared to downbow strokes, your bow is likely enjoying its freedom. When there is no elasticity in the sound, it has a likeness to mechanical sound or non-living sound. For example, think of an alarm that has gone off and it doesn't vary and it doesn't end. Your car alarm when it goes off at one time, your alarm in the morning, smoke alarms when they're testing them, right? School alarms. Or how about the sound of a machine? You know, it's constant. The highway is another one. You know, the sounds just keep going. There's some sort of loud, especially when you're in traffic. So we've all been there. This is a good moment to consider accents. Generally, a beat is considered down. There is certain weight on it. An accelerated down motion in a note creates an accent or emphasis in the weight of sound. If we put a strong up action on the beat, the implication for the weight is that it happens later, creating a syncopation. This is a normal 4/4 pattern. Note the weight on the ictus and the rebound of each beat. These are accented beats. Two hands can reinforce the weight. In your playing and singing, I'd encourage you to engage a bigger part of your physical system. In your breathing for wind players and singers, in your bow arm for string players, and in your regular arm for percussionists and pianists, to create that weight in your physical system, which then creates the weight in your playing and in your singing. Syncopations are similar to accents, but notice that the weight and the energy is up on the beats rather than down. If the notes are sustained and that offbeat nature occurs, that's a hemiola. Notice the up action on the beats during hemiolas. The downbeat or king, where the hemiola returns to its normal weighting, is always dynamic. It feels like hemiolas are heavier than the other patterns we've done so far, after it starts until it releases at the next downbeat or the next king. See what you think about that. A special note about accents and sforzandi. The king is always king. If an accent occurs on any beat other than the downbeat in a measure, it metrically still is within the royal balance we examined earlier. We can look at the micromanagement of metric balance within the beat. If the weight is on the beginning of a beat that has 4/16 notes in it, the first one, unless they're modifying dynamics, implies a metric balance in the notes until the next beat. Even 2/8 notes are not equal. One is on the beat and the other one is not. Let's look at the Vivaldi A minor violin concerto one more time. If the weight is on the beginning of a beat that has 2/8 notes or 4/16 notes, the first one implies a shape in the other notes until the next beat. Let's hear what that sounds like. We'll speak later about the teachings of some well-known music mentors. For this moment, the weight of 16th notes within a beat is so aptly delineated by the phonetic analogy "lucka-pucka," which was used by conducting mentor Gustav Meyer. When we are conducting or playing single notes, such as quarter notes or half notes, the space they take after they rebound from their beginning has dynamic shape, weight change, and development. Our style, without rebound, elicits a short or dry sound. Here's a 4/4 pattern. This is with elasticity or rebound on each beat. This is dry with very little rebound. And this is what we call marking. It's sort of a French style where we just really don't rebound at all. Be done very fast. We show duration of a note as a conductor and the weight concept in the same way as any musician sustaining a tone. After the beginning weight, the note lightens or has shape in some way. The amount of horizontal motion in the baton defines the length of the note and where the next note begins. These are long notes. These are short notes. And these are completely legato. In other words, where and how we lift the weight of the note defines style. Well, a musical rest or silence is either leading up to a musical event, at which point its whole dynamicism is gaining weight, which is the nature of anticipation, or It's the time after the completion of an event, at which point the energy is dissipating. Actually, it's the same for each played note. They are either gaining momentum and weight or relaxing, which is lightening the weight. If you consider that concept for each note and rest you play, it brings sparkle to those that otherwise may not have had character or direction. It is interesting to also look at the king, that place of emphasis and structural importance, and see what impact it has for periods and phrases. When we begin a 4-bar phrase, which is sometimes titled an antecedent phrase, the first measure is primary, especially in the classic era. The usual progression is that the third measure is the queen, or with second structural importance. And the knight would, similarly in proportion to the beats within a bar, be the second measure of the phrase. We can see that in the Bach minuet. The fifth measure begins the answering phrase and also begins a new 4-measure metric pattern. And yet, it is secondary in weight in the greater period, which begins with the antecedent phrase. In the Mozart 40th Symphony, second movement, we can also see 4-measure phrases with a normal weight pattern for a classic structure. This architecture we've spoken of, where each measure is part of a larger system of relative weights and phrasing, is called hypermeter. In symphonies, concerti, sonatas, and multiple movement works, downbeats, in particular the primary downbeat, begins to define the whole rest of the work. If the notes and note groups are the micro application of this concept, then how it impacts the structure of phrases, movements, and whole works within a composer's output can be considered the macro application. The sections within a piece generally follow the metric balance progressions we've seen within the micro applications. The first, or A theme, is generally stronger, more solid in nature than the B, or lyrical theme. In minuets and trios, the trio is largely lighter in nature. It's in binary form, which is in 2 parts. Frequently, a third, or C theme, has a tertiary weight relationship. It's the knight. In those pieces with an introduction, which is music that occurs before the main theme, no matter the dynamic, the intrinsic weight of the movement structure is based on the primary theme. This is important. Even if the introduction would have louder dynamic indications and the primary theme would enter softly, still, the metric sense of weight and structure is derived from the primary theme, the king. Similarly, with a coda, if the structural elements have already passed, it might be colorful, lively, and vivacious, but it likely is not royal. We can contemplate the codas in the first and fourth movements of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, for example. Always the innovator, Beethoven put thematic weight in his codas. They are the exception. They could be considered for knighthood, whereas most codas are lighter in nature. This is the coda of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, first movement. It is performed by the Otakar Chamber Orchestra. If your piece is a single movement, the concepts we've spoken of thus far govern its metric balance. It's rare to find a larger structure with just 2 movements. 3-movement works are more common. Many times, the movements are composed with the pattern fast, slow, and then fast. Haydn, Mozart, and Johann Christian Bach help establish this pattern in symphonic music. It is found in instrumental music of many eras as well. Notice the first movement has the most weight in character and structure. Many times one finds a sonata form for the first movement. The other 2 frequently are dance movements or have binary structure. The sonata form is solid, has significant structure. It is the king in 3-movement pieces. In 4-movement pieces, the first movement is still most harmonically, developmentally, and thematically dense. Thus, you'll find it to be most weighty in the metric sense. Similarly to the 3-movement structure, it tends to be in sonata form and it tends to be fast. In traditional structure, we generally find movements in the fast, slow, minuet or scherzo, and light and lively movements such as a rondo or dance to complete the work. As in a single measure, the 3rd movement tends to be the queen, or the movement that has the 2nd primary metric weight. One other 4-movement structure tended to be in the order of slow, fast, slow, fast. Here we also see the grouping of 2 movements, rendering the 3rd movement to be the queen, as the fast movements are showy and less harmonically dense than the slow movements. We find this in the Baroque and early classic eras. J.S. Bach, in his solo sonatas and partitas, changed this order by placing very significant chaconnes and fugues in 4 parts for 1 solo violin on the 2nd movements of the pieces. There are several famous 5-movement structures, notably Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral. The last 3 movements are performed without pause, and so his structure of 2 movements plus 3 movements is something to consider. The king is the 1st movement, the queen is the 3rd. For many years, I've been notating weight with a vertical bar of varying lengths to indicate metric balance in scores and parts. I've found the following measure indications helpful. They imply relative weight structure in addition to phrase beginnings and endings. Recently, we've identified several written symbols one might incorporate to identify the royal characters associated with the metric positions. One thing you can listen for in your everyday is the weight in the speech patterns you hear. The concept of flexing and placing weight in words, sentences, paragraphs, and complete thoughts is the same as in music. The more that we can hear it in the way human thought is expressed by voice, the more we can incorporate those weight inflections in our music. As one contemplates the nature of weight in the note, inner beat, measure, gesture, phrase, or paragraph, there could be and frequently are multiple and varied weight dynamics happening at the same time. What is most important is that you understand the concept that you can apply to the area of the music that you're looking at and working on. Dorothy DeLay, one of the legendary violin mentors in her day, had a very detailed Excel chart with the technical items and concepts she would checkmark for her students to incorporate after their lessons. This is a chart with the metric balance concepts that you can access at zmusicintl.com on the studio page. You will then have a reference to consider each level of this weight management or emphasis within the pieces you are preparing. In his teaching the "one is down" concept, the revered and legendary conducting mentor Charles Bruck would exclaim to an aspiring conductor, "Well, one is down." The student would then attempt a second round of the passage with this concept at heart. On many occasions, it was followed with a walk by Maestro Bruck from his chair at the back of the stage up to the podium, where he would more personally and somewhat pointedly relay, "One is down." Many memories of this. This was sometimes accompanied by additional vigorous efforts to show the impact of one being down, such as stepping on the conductor's foot for each downbeat or other creative techniques. If these didn't produce result, he would step back and relay, "But one is down," very emphatically, and go back to his music stand with his scores, his briefcase and chair in the back of the stage in a frustrated manner. One day, he was so completely spent and mentally exhausted with the effort, he walked off the stage, through the concert hall, and went straight outside for a walk because this concept was so important for him to impart to his students. Here we are, a quarter century later, and Maestro, happy to say, it still matters. Joseph Gifford, coach we mentioned earlier, encouraged his students to completely empty their energy on the downbeat. Let it have no barriers, release any tension, he would say, and fill yourself and the music with fresh and new life on the up motion. He relayed to allow yourself to change with the energy at any given moment. It's right there. Be present to take it in, he would encourage. In the Czech Republic, Maestro Frantisek Vajnar, who led the Prague Radio Symphony, the Czech Philharmonic, taught at the Prague Conservatory, and led the Hradec Králové Philharmonic, as well as mentored many conductors, was a master of varying speeds into and out of the ictus. That is the moment when the weight changes from down to up in a conductor's beat. He had the fastest up motions in his baton technique I have ever seen. This is applicable to instrumentalists thinking about the speed with which they release notes. His colleague in mentoring conductors at the repertoire workshops, which were developed by the late Dr. Harry Hurwitz, is Maestro Otakar Trhlik. He led the Prague Symphony and the Czech Radio Symphony in numerous recordings, was music director of the Janáček Philharmonic, and also taught at the Janáček Music Academy. In score study or review sessions, he would be inquiring about a moment on the podium or a passage in the score and say, "What is the fantasy of the music?" Or, "You must have fantasy here." Meaning, your vision of the spirit of the music will impact the weight, the energy, and the balances of the music you perform and rehearse. Barbra Streisand, in her recording entitled "One Voice," speaks of each note having value, some shorter, some longer. In metric balance, each note is dynamic. None are simply passive by nature of the relationship they have to the other neighboring notes. The advice of these mentors applied to all musicians who are contemplating the pieces or works of art they have before them. When is the defining downward energy of the motion enough? When it can carry the music to the next position held by structure or royalty. Keep in mind that downward motion can be per note, per beat, per measure, and so on. It must contain the elasticity and dynamic tension necessary to carry the piece forward. Musically, the down motion is complete when the downbeat or primary unit you are working with carries the stylistic integrity to enable the up energy to the next structure point with the correct energy and character. We went through conducting training, and Harold used to have something called registration, and we spend so much time as conductors, not only, and probably all musicians, to understand the music, but also understand how to execute it. Now, you've seen some pretty significant conductors and orchestras in your day. Do you have anything you'd speak to how people use their personality or the character, or what have you seen over the years? Because we started with somebody who taught a very structured way of understanding that motion, but now you've seen it in real life. What do you got? Any perspectives?
You put your finger on one of the, and Harold did, obviously, because he was working with us on it. Is yes, that metric balance, which is, I find that I also have to do that as a recording producer. You have to be able to focus at once on the short term, little detail, but you also have to have the big picture of the whole piece. And so when you think of pulse and density and meter and those kinds of things, you have the minutia of this bar, this bar, this bar, this rhythm, this pulse kind of thing. But also the entire piece has an architecture and a kind of a breathing. It has a pulse that underlies everything that's happening in the piece. And so a conductor and a producer have to be able to comprehend both of those aspects of a piece. It's this, and this, but it's also, I think one of the things I've observed in listening to conductors and orchestras and watching what the conductors are doing is almost all the conductors that I see manage to be more economical in their physical gestures than we were when we were young, and we thought it was all very active and very big. There's a greater sense of economy in veteran conductors because I think they've absorbed and they've learned how to convey both the immediate necessary information for the immediate thing that's happening in the music, but they also are managing that underlying pulse and that underlying inhalation, exhalation, the bigger density and cycle of the architecture of the piece. What I find I have to do in producing a recording is you've got to be able to zero in on the immediate thing, but also know where that little immediate thing fits in everything else that's going on.
And that's why retakes and multiple takes sometimes can work and sometimes can backfire, right? Because
both as a conductor and as a producer, when you ask an orchestra, for instance, to play something again, sometimes you have to give them details. You have to say, clarinet at letter B, this is sharp. Give the list of little details that need to be fixed. And sometimes you simply have to say, let's do that again. Because one of the other things I think I've learned is that there are no secrets on the stage. Everybody in the orchestra knows what's happening. They hear what's happening. And there are times when you don't have to point anything out. People know what needs to be addressed. But there are times when you just have to give them another chance. So again, sometimes you give them the detail and sometimes you just give them another chance. Say, let's do that again. And everybody just knows what to do. And the conductor can help make that possible, but it's really only because everybody in the orchestra really knows what they need to do. So it's just that, again, that instantaneous switch from the detail to the big picture.
Said as somebody who's seen it many times, right? Yeah.
Yep.
The value of everything we've considered so far is when we can incorporate it into the music we're playing. All of us have some natural weight in our playing, singing, or conducting already. Physicalizing a greater weight vocabulary in our music will enhance its expressive qualities and dynamicism. We are taught to use our fingers, hands, arms, diaphragm, and embouchure very specifically to produce sound. Let's take a moment away from our instruments to consider which part of our spirit and body systems might best serve as music, which would accompany these following images. You can use your weight from the floor up, your heels, your hips, your knees, your toes, your feet, your arms, your torso, your head, your shoulders, your back. Use everything. Use it in a new way. Notice your body weight drops when you bend your knees. In the case of delicate music or these images, consider using just your wrists or fingers. Try expanding up into a space you usually don't go to. Consider your arm weight springing from your elbows or dropping lower than them for heaviness. How does your rib cage or torso feed in? Be free in these moments to feel weight in an unrestricted way, one not related to your instrument technique. Motions from sport, dance, or other human activities may come to mind. They're all fair game. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. Let's all stand up, even if you perform sitting down. The important thing is to expand your playing or performance space in some way. Your mission is to find physical motions which would be appropriate to the energy in the following photos. The photos will progress in silence. Last thought, let's also move the placement of our feet and find new places to be in. Now, let's take a quiet moment and imagine allowing those motions and experiences to combine with the metric balance in music understanding you have. That motion and concept vocabulary you've experienced is with you, always. If you knew Joe Gifford, or have seen the beautifully done video series Music of Life by Jill Uchiyama, which is on Vimeo, you'd feel some of his approach in the exercise we've just completed. In his Music of Life series, which was conceived just before he passed at age 97, he reflects on his life in the arts, coaching dancers, actors, and musicians, most notably conductors. The legacy he wanted to impart to us, and it's here for us, is the rhythms and cycles in life are music. If we can perceive them, they become part of our music and part of us. He relayed to be in the music, to feel our physical motions and presence in a way that is bigger than our minds. Remember, music is larger than technique. It relates to life. Life is its spirit and personality, which gives it weight and lifts it. The weight in life relates to the weight in our music. As this video presentation comes to a close, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to think about metric balance in music with me. I've enjoyed considering the materials and preparing them for you. As you continue on your musical path, know there is an entourage of music royalty you take with you always. Every best to you in your musical endeavors.